Imagine being prescribed a medication for a simple stomach issue, only to have it quietly take over your life for the next 12 years. Well, that's exactly what happened to today's guest, Dee Foster. His story is one of profound loss, 2 careers gone, severe pain that left him bedridden, and the fight to hold on to his marriage, while battling symptoms that no one seemed to understand. From trembling hands and sleepless nights to losing the ability to work, Dee has endured what most people can't even imagine. But what's most remarkable is how he turned his nightmare into a mission to help others heal. Stay with us as we unpack this incredible journey and uncover the truths about benzodiazepines doctors rarely discuss. So Dee, thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us. I think where I'd like to start is just by asking you, how did benzodiazepines enter your life in the first place?
Yeah, happy to help. I was prescribed Clonazepam back in 2002, I think it was, by my primary care for stomach distress. And I think after trying different things, I had chronic stomach distress my whole life. After trying several things, I think he thought that maybe there was an anxiety factor or something, so he prescribed that. I took it without thinking about it for 12 years, went up to 2 milligrams later on, and then went from doctor to doctor, no warnings, no cautions, no nothing. And finally, I went to a new doctor when I relocated, and she prescribed me Prozac, and I asked what that was for, and she said that was to help you come off the Klonopin. And I didn't know I needed to come off the Klonopin. That was a surprise to me. And so I made the mistake of looking up online about benzodiazepine dependence. And of course, read the horror stories, had full-out panic attack, had all the fun stuff that goes with that. Started to realize that I was intolerant, started noticing some of the symptoms I'd been dealing with for the last few months. And anyway, I wanted to come off the drug, and I knew I wanted to. I went back to my doc. A couple docs wouldn't help me. I finally went back to a doctor up in the mountains who I'd gone to a little while back. And even though he didn't believe I needed to come off the drug, he was willing to work with me, and I trusted him, and he trusted me. And that's what I needed somebody who just would listen to me. He said, I don't think you have to come off it, but if you want to, I'll work with you. And he made me stabilize for 6 months, which was frustrating at the time, but the best thing probably that he could have done.
Let me jump in.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and let me ask you this. So you get put on the drug back in 2010 for stomach distress. At what point did you start thinking, maybe this isn't helping me anymore? Maybe this is something I need to come off. Like, how did you end up coming to that conclusion? Because so many people, they'll just stay on them forever.
I didn't. It was that other doctor prescribing Prozac for me to come off of the benzodiazepine. I never really, I go back and think that all the time, because I know so often people I work with are like, well, I didn't have a part in this. And I agree, I didn't create this problem, but I never once in 12 years looked up the drug. I never thought about it. I never looked up to see if there were problems or complications. I just kept taking it. But it was this new doc that I went to, and when I started going to her, she prescribed me an SSRI to help me come off the benzo. And that's when I started asking questions. So that was the triggering factor, was at that point.
But it sounds like after you started looking into it, you started to notice that maybe the drug was having some adverse effects on you. I mean, is that a correct read?
That is a correct read. Yeah. And I think it's so common. I think you and I both have seen that many times, where we just don't always attribute some of the complications we have to the medication at the time. I didn't really realize that some of my growing issues, like one of the biggest ones was my vertigo. I had ongoing vertigo. I never knew I attributed it to the benzodiazepine. And that was more side effect than it was a sign of dependence, because I actually cleared up when I came off the drug. But I was having other factors. My anxiety was slowly creeping up again. And it had been over the years. So it wasn't exactly doing, the work anymore. I was starting to have some symptoms, some minor symptoms, a little bit of cognitive dysfunction. And so once I found out about this and I kind of got through the panic attack and looked back, I started to see, okay, there might be some reasons for these things that I didn't realize. And I'd gone to the doctor on several of these, and nobody even thought to second guess the benzodiazepine.
But you got on this drug not because of anxiety. It sounds like you were taking it because you were having some stomach upset.
Yep. That's what I was prescribed for originally. Now, like I said, I can't read into the physician's mind. My guess is he thought maybe anxiety was part of why I was having the stomach distress. And he probably was right in that regard. I've had some anxiety. I was never diagnosed with any anxiety disorder officially. I've had anxiety off and on, but not extreme. And I never told him about that. So it was one of those things where it was originally prescribed for stomach issues, which I now know is so common to have them prescribed, off label for so many different things. So
you were on benzos a lot longer than I was. I mean, when I was on Xanax, it was probably for about 6 months. And that was right after my daughter was born, and I was doing night shifts actually for a telepsychiatry company. I'd come on at like 10 o'clock and work until the morning. And so NP was prescribing them for me, once a week, but then it kind of creeps up. And then before you know it, you're taking it every night. And I never really had a lot of problems with anxiety, but then I started to have obsessive intrusive thoughts, which I was luckily able to recognize were a problem with the medications, because that was my life. While I was working at the telepsych company, I was still really interested in drug side effects, and I was able to put 2 and 2 together. But I do think a lot of people don't realize that these drugs can really mess with your mood in subtle ways, and it could easily be missed or overlooked or misdiagnosed as something else. Which I see a lot nowadays.
Well, and one of the benefits for me too was I've always been a voracious reader and researcher. It's just kind of been my personality for years. So I just dived in and I read everything I could find, every site I could go to, every book I could get my hands on to learn about what this was. In fact, in the end, I had researched over 1,000 articles and books and everything on benzodiazepines and on other factors related to it, anxiety, even happiness, even just the general things about just overall mood. And that's actually what led me to write my book. Was I finally just had all this research and I wanted to do something with it rather than just, let it sit there. So that's kind of what got me started in all of this, was just coming off that drug and trying to figure things out.
Well, let's talk about that, coming off the drug. Tell me about your experience getting off Clonazepam, right?
Yeah. I did a direct taper off of Clonazepam. I used Ashton. That was the best tool at the time. As you know, there weren't a lot of the online services like Taper Clinic and other ones available really to help us taper. It was mostly on our own. Most physicians, of course, weren't aware of what to do. We didn't have the Maudsley guideline. We didn't have any of this stuff out there to really use. But Ashton was out there, thank God. And so I used that guideline and I did my own taper. I ran my own schedule and I actually brought it to my doctor and said, this is what I want to do. And I showed him the schedule and he was okay with it. So after the 6 months of stabilizing, I took 18 months to direct taper and come off of clonazepam. I finally jumped off of a 1/4 milligram because I was doing a direct taper and that's as small as I knew I could cut the pill. I had a 0.5 milligram pill and I cut it in half and that was the smallest dose. I didn't think about, scales. I didn't think about liquid titration. I wasn't thinking about all these things. And I didn't want to substitute because I just felt that was going to complicate things even more. I just wanted to come off. I so badly wanted the drug out of my body because I had the visualization where this is doing bad things to me. And so I want it out of there. And so I didn't want to add more drugs to the solution, good or bad. That was just the direction I decided to take. So 18 months I did. My symptoms coming off I definitely had symptoms and I had some strong ones at times, but I was managing. At one point I had to updose. I had a full out panic attack and I did updose for about 6 months in my taper. But then I kept going. My biggest problems, and I've seen this a lot with clonazepam, it was after my last dose. And so the first few years after that is when it got bad.
So just so I have the time frame, how many years were you taking it for before you initiated this 18-month taper? 12 years.
I was on it for
12 years. Yeah. Now, okay, so we're talking about Clonazepam. So I think the lowest dose is 1/4 milligram. Is that right, D?
It was 0.5 at the time that I tapered. I don't know if it's changed at this point. So okay. I cut at 0.5 milligram in half to get to 0.25.
So, I mean, most people would think, hey, you tapered for 18 months. You've gone down to half of the smallest pill that you can get. That sounds like a pretty safe taper. I mean, that sounds like a good way to go. And I also think that if you're looking at the Ashton manual as well, I mean, the Ashton manual, often in those worked out examples, it'll have people jump off at that level.
Yeah, so, to a certain point, when she reached a certain point, she would say, go ahead and take the jump. And she also addressed the fear of taking that jump, but she would say, just do it. And so I went for it and did it.
You wouldn't be here today with me on this podcast if things went smoothly, Dee. So tell us what happened when you took that job. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it was crazy. I came off the drug and things were okay for a little bit, but it wasn't too long till I started getting just symptom after symptom after symptom. I finally counted them about 75 one time. I thankfully kept a journal the whole time, and that also became part of my book. So it was nice to have all that information. And I went back and started just looking at all I went through, because it's also easy to forget some of the symptoms you had in earlier stages. And when I look back at my history, I realized what I was in. I was bedridden at times, couldn't leave the house at times, couldn't drive. I couldn't think straight. I was shaking. I was trying to work for a while during a lot of this time, the tapering and coming off. And there were times, one time I remember at work, half my body was shaking so much, I had to call my wife and have her pick me up and bring me home, because, I couldn't drive. There was no way I could drive home. And she had to get me home. And so I used to be a database developer, and I also was a screenwriter and screenwriting instructor. And both those jobs were taken away from me. I couldn't do any of those anymore.
So Dee, one of the things I like to do on these podcasts is do some teaching points for people who are early in the journey. So my question to you is, how long after coming off did the bottom fall out? And that's like a kind of a colloquial way I talk about this with my colleagues, because it's really common that you come off and maybe you have some withdrawal symptoms, but maybe it's not that bad. And then I see usually, maybe 2 to 3 months afterwards, sometimes it's even longer than that, maybe 6 months afterwards, it hits the fan. And so could you provide some insight into that weird phenomenon where, people come off and they feel like maybe okay, and then like several months later, the bottom falls out essentially.
And I'm doing the best off memory I can. That's why my book comes in handy. I always pull that back out and try to remind myself. But it is exactly what you mentioned, which was, again, my tapering was very difficult but manageable most of the time. And then finally I took that last dose. And I think I still had the tapering. It wasn't much difference in the tapering for probably a month or so. And then quite rapidly things started to progress. And that's why I was still working during that time, but it wasn't long before I could no longer work. I could no longer handle any kind of stress that came into my life. I'd become almost a non-functioning human. I couldn't really tackle anything.
And so that what you described, it really is what I would say the typical experience when it comes to developing protracted withdrawal injury. You get this slight delay, and then you develop all of the symptoms, which I'm going to discuss in a moment. But the thing that I think is most relevant to people is that the doctors completely miss it, because if you're having a delay of symptoms building up after a month of coming off, or sometimes even 3 months after coming off, your doctor is going to look at you sideways if you go in there and say, "Oh, I'm in withdrawal." They'll say you're crazy, because usually withdrawal is over, within 2 weeks, and sometimes maybe up to a month, but it's not, really kicking off at that month mark. And so they start thinking that the person has something else going on.
Yeah. Agreed. And I'd done so much research and read so much and understood the action manual and everything. So most of the things that hit me, I had read about or I knew could hit me. I would say 90% of the things I found in our manual somewhere. And I was grateful for that. So at least I kind of knew what was going on. It didn't take all the fear away for sure. But the anxiety that came on was anxiety I'd never known in my life before. The cognitive dysfunction.
And I would say, I'm sorry, I was going to say, Dee, that's probably pretty uncommon, that someone while going through it at that time would know what's happening to them, because most of the people that I speak to, it takes them sometimes it can take them several months to figure it out, sometimes years. And I spoke to someone recently who had been sick for 10 years and he found the channel, and it was an interview with a German guy, and he was just like, "This is what happened to me."
I get that all the time through the podcast. The number of people that come to me in the podcast that have said, I've been dealing with this for years. I get these. I've worked with I think 700, 800, 900 people directly through the podcast. And we had thousands that would listen to it. And so many of them have come to me and said, I had no idea, or I didn't know what this was. I didn't know what was causing this. I've been to doctor after doctor after doctor after doctor, and nobody can diagnose what's wrong with me. It's fibromyalgia, it's MS, it's Parkinson's, it's something. And then they finally realize maybe it's this drug they've been taking. Yeah. And so you run into that all the time.
So let's talk about what happened, for someone that may not be familiar with this. So and I'd like to get your take on it. So a benzodiazepine protracted withdrawal injury, or bind, benzodiazepine-induced neurological dysfunction, same name, different way of
pretty much
the same thing, is it's a brain injury, essentially. So you come off the medications, and for reasons I don't think anyone understands fully, there's a slight delay, and then it's like you develop full-on neurological dysfunction or damage. And I mean, that sounds like what you were describing. I mean, you had cognitive impairment. You were describing symptoms of internal tremors and shaking. I often, when I used to do house calls with my patients, I'd put my hand on their back and I would just feel them vibrating. I'd look at their faces and their eyelids would be fluttering. They're just shaking. And on top of that, you get this crazy, intense, catastrophic anxiety that doesn't go away, all while your brain isn't working and your mind isn't functioning. And it's kind of the most horrifying type of neurological injury that could happen to you. And then it doesn't go away when you get back on the drug. And it's something that just you kind of have to ride out. It does get better, but it's serious when it happens.
It really, I mean, it's life-threatening for some people, and that's a fact. And it's hard to say that, but yeah, you mentioned the bind. I mean, I'm on the research team that created the terminology, and the nosology team that put that together. And when we discovered bind, it wasn't that we didn't know about protracted. And I think you knew this. We knew there was protracted, effects. Where bind was differentiated, and what we noticed with that was that we differentiated actually even specific symptoms between acute withdrawal and the protracted state. And that's where we first started to notice there might be neurotoxicity, neuroadaptation, involved with what's happened. So this is that long-term neurological damage that has been caused. Is when we saw that there's certain symptoms that are typical for acute withdrawal, and with other medications they're very similar. But with benzodiazepines, there's this protracted state that is really serious. And that's the one that kicked in for me. I think I had tapered slow enough, and I had a decent taper, that the acute withdrawal was not very severe for me, but that was only about 28 days. After that, then I started kicking into the protracted, and I've already had some symptoms of it before. So, I mean, it doesn't mean that protracted and bind symptoms have to kick in afterwards. They can kick in. I've been working on this timeline with some people that have been asking me lately, what's the timeline and exactly when is bind and when is acute? And I say, well, the terminology is not necessarily exact. And we're still kind of differentiating that because, different teams have different ideas of what is meant by protracted. Some say, it's after 18 months off the drug. Some say it's after 28 days off the drug. How they differentiate that. So it's kind of confusing.
Yeah. I'm no researcher, but I will just share my 2 cents on it. I mean, for something to be withdrawal, to me, it goes away when you put the drug back. Anytime the symptoms don't go away when you put the drug back, we're not talking about you being in acute withdrawal from the drug, because if you were, the symptoms would go away when you reintroduced it. And so at that point, and I try a lot of reintroductions with my patients when they come to me. At that point, it's bind. It's bind or protracted or whatever you want to call it. We're talking about neurological damage. Then.
I would agree with that. Yeah. And it's crazy. It's, that it's not more known and it's not known to look for. And I think that, as you mentioned, that's one of the biggest problems we have is even most physicians and even some psychiatrists don't know to look for these problems as being an effect of the medication. Yeah. Especially after they stop taking them.
Yeah. Dee, I want to ask you about your symptoms because, it's one thing to kind of talk about what this thing is, but it's another thing to live through it. And we get a lot of family members that watch this channel, friends of people who are suffering, and also people who are early on in the journey. And it's always they always find it helpful to have their experience validated and just to kind of understand the texture of what it is like to suffer from one of these things. So I know we're kind of going back in time, but you also still have some lingering symptoms. But maybe you could talk about, maybe you could talk about right back then, because usually the first couple of years are pretty bad. Walk us through a day in your shoes back then, just to bring it all back, and just to give people a sense of what it's like in the early days.
Yeah, and I'll do my best. 10 years out, they blur together, but I'll do my best to identify. The biggest ones were the extreme anxiety and the cognitive dysfunction. Any stress would send me over. I couldn't focus. That's why I had to stop working. I had cognitive dysfunction, a lot of memory loss. I couldn't remember anything. I was having, especially short term, I was having trouble making the memories. Multitasking was out the window for me. I could do one task maybe at a time, but anything more than that was overwhelming, and I was quickly overwhelmed. So the mental faculties were probably some of the severest, but insomnia was really significant for me early on. That definitely has improved, thank God, but it was for the first few years. I would go 3-4 nights sometimes without sleeping. Was not uncommon, very difficult. Akathisia, I still have that today. That's been a factor of mine. Usually in the evening, I get the restlessness and I have to move and I have to do something. It's definitely improved, but I still have that. Depression. I've had other physical things like throat tightening. In fact, I had my esophagus widened last year because of a setback I had with this. So dysphagia, I had that. Nerve pain and aches, and the muscle aches have been quite severe at times. I would pull muscles, I would strain muscles. Again, benzos are such strong muscle relaxants. You come off those and suddenly, you're kind of stuck with all those problems. One of the biggest ones that I had that I wasn't diagnosed with at first was I had severe abdominal pain and urinary difficulties and other stuff, and I was diagnosed with prostatitis by a urologist. Unfortunately, it was prescribed with a fluoroquinolone because of it, and I took the drug because I didn't really know enough to not take it or to ask for something different. Of course, quinolones alone have their own boxed warning for neuropathy, so I'm sure that didn't help what I went through. I later realized what that was diagnosed with prostatitis was actually pelvic floor dysfunction caused by the benzodiazepines. And so my whole gut has just been kind of pelvic floor, dysfunction. I have distension. I've had all kinds of stomach problems. For a period of time, I was eating chicken and white rice, and that's the only thing I could eat for several months in a row. So I've had hyperalgesia, burning skin, flushing, tinnitus. I've had 3 levels of tinnitus. I have difficulty speaking. Sometimes I do get tongue-tied quite easily. I've had heart palpitations. Those have gotten better. Air hunger, gasping, difficulty swallowing. It goes on and on. I don't know when you want me to stop, but that's some of the stuff I've dealt with.
So I want you to walk us through now the impact that something like this has on your life. I think about things like career. I think about things like friends, romantic relationships. Walk us through how something like this, actually, how old were you when this happened?
I would have been, 10, I got to work backwards here. So 47 or so. I'm now 59.
So maybe you could just paint a picture of what your life was like before it happened, and then how this changed all of those things, work, romance, relationships, all that.
Yeah. I was blessed that I'm married to a wonderful woman and she stayed by my side. So that's a huge piece. It was a huge strain, of course, on us, as you know, as so many people we work with face. But thankfully, she stayed with me and she's been my rock. And I'm very grateful for that. I know some people that don't have anything like that. Family's been I've been blessed on that too. It's been pretty amazing. Both my family and my wife's family have been understanding. They still don't get it, and they still often expect certain things that I can't handle or can't do. But when we talk to them, they do understand and they do the best they can. So again, I know that's not typical for a lot of people. So I was lucky in that regard. Outside of that, I was, like I said, I'd done database programming for years, 25 years. I was a database in IT. Then I was working in film and did film festival organization and was teaching screenwriting and stuff like that. And I lost both of those careers and both of those groups of people entirely. Mostly that was me. I just cut it off. I couldn't. I just walked away. Most of them don't even know what happened to me or that something happened. I just disappeared. It was too much to deal with. And so I created a very small world, which I see with so many people I work with, is we just bring that world down to as small as possible because it's hard. I couldn't watch news for about 5 years. I actually tuned out from news entirely. It was too much for me. I got too worked up. Like a perfect example is if I watch something now that distresses me on the news, it's there for 10, 15 minutes and I move on. Back then it was there for about a day before I could overcome that anger or that frustration. The anger and irritability were there. It definitely affected my relationship. I had to find methods to work around it with my wife, so that, she didn't, wasn't in the room when I started to yell things and stuff like that. So we had a clue where it's like I could walk away, and she understood when I walked away. And it was amazing. After 10 minutes walking away, I was usually okay and I'd come back, but I would get very angry sometimes. And I had a lot of that for a while. Yeah, it was just a bit, it changed my life entirely. And I don't know anybody who goes through this at that level, who it doesn't completely change their life. And it changed my personality. That's another symptom we've listed in our research recently, is personality change. I am a different person now than I was.
I want us to get your impression on this. And yeah, I've heard this comparison before, but I also, I have a really close friend of mine who has a child with mild autism. And when I watch children play together, I can't help but think about protracted withdrawal, because when we go to activities together, the volume, sometimes the noise is too loud, and the child will become, very upset and very sensitive and go away. Sometimes if there's a lot of strong emotions going on, she'll have to, take a moment, kind of, go somewhere else. And so when I look at my patients with protracted withdrawal, I do think of these autistic children who have these really sensitive nervous systems, and I think a lot of people, they've seen like a child with autism, something that will happen that's benign, and it's benign to you, but to the other person, it can be really aggravating, or it can even be painful. And so I feel like
exactly.
When we notice these personality changes in our protracted patients, that's, you go from someone who has a intact nervous system to someone who is like a snail without a shell, with the nerves just so sensitive to everything. And it's like a completely different person.
I've seen it too, because actually I've had, like you have, a few people reach me through the podcast over the years that have had children or a nephew or niece with autism, and they've had similar comparisons. So I thought that was quite interesting. Being on the spectrum, there's crossover there. There's something there. So yeah, I think there's a lot of insight there in seeing that happen, because there's so much, so much going on. We're still figuring out how much of this, but there's a lot of crossover.
And it's the same, you can't tell someone with autism, you really just need to just put yourself out there and just expose yourself to it, and it'll desensitize you and you'll feel better. It's the same with the protracted patients. We're not talking about something that you will yourself through. It's like, it's kind of like this different nervous system here.
And it's both. Yeah. That's one thing we kind of talk about too, is we had that come up on our site not too long ago about, when do you say, hey, this is a problem, this is actual real, you need to believe me? And then when do you also help encourage people to, start to climb their way out? And it's knowing that balance, because there is a state that we're in when we're just too extreme, and we need to be protected, and we need to heal, and we can't handle the outside. But then there's also a time of, okay, we've done that, starting to heal a little bit. Now it's time to expand that box. It's time to start to move slowly and start to get back into the world. And even that's one of the things we're working on is, trying to help people with both of those. You got to have that protected area for a while to heal. But when you're ready, we want to help encourage people start to get back, because there is that learning deficit that Ashton talks about. That's also a factor here too, is that we're out of practice also, in managing anxiety and managing the world. And the more isolated you are for a period of time, not only do you have the neurological damage, but you also have, just this learning deficit of, I haven't had to deal with these things for some time. And I always thought that was interesting that she included that in her manual.
I was just thinking it's kind of interesting. if my timing is right, when you cut off from the news and you went into your shell, you would have come out and Trump would have been president. It would have been like, surprise, D,
I know. Yeah, exactly.
Welcome to the world.
I thankfully had a filter. I had a wife who, if something significant happened, she could let me know calmly and say, oh, by the way, there's a new president. Or, by the way, there's a war. And she could calmly kind of tell me. But actually, the number one thing I realized when I came out of that was how little I missed. I didn't miss much. I really didn't miss much. And so it's helped me realize that I don't need to be that in tune. I now can watch news without much problem, but I don't have to be tuned into it like I used to, because I didn't miss much. I really didn't.
Yeah.
So it was okay.
D, how did you survive financially? I mean, it sounds like this totally wiped you out in terms of career. Yeah.
I was, again, very lucky. My wife, I just got to be honest. My wife had a steady job, and she helped carry us for years, and still to this day. In fact, our online our site uneven.life that I just launched is the first revenue generating thing of any volume that I've done. I've had some donations for the podcast over the years, and I wrote a book, so a little bit trickles in from that, but I've never made more than my expenses any single year for the last 8 or 9 years. So I've been at a loss all that time. So thankfully my wife has had a decent job, and she's been able to support me. But I never wanted that to continue as long as it did. And so one of the things I am doing now is I'm trying to, so we're getting the membership site going, and that'll help bring some revenue in to help offset, the work I do. But it's been hard. This is a very difficult, as you know, arena to, make a living at, especially from people like me without medical background and like that, because so many people are distressed and out of work, so it's hard for them to pay for services. And it becomes a very difficult situation. And I've just continued to do the work and didn't think about it because I had that luxury. But so many people don't have that gift to have some income. And I know I was lucky for that, and I'm very grateful.
Now, D, I mean, I know you kind of hate being correct me if I'm wrong. I imagine you don't like being the person where someone like me would have to say something like this, which is usually people aren't as sick as long as you. But I do know that there's some people that are going to hear this story and say, "Oh my God, 10 years! Like, I'm going to take myself out now. This is so bad." That's not that common. In fact, it's highly uncommon from what I see, and I'm glad to hear you say that as well. But still, there may be some people out there who are having more long-term symptoms. And I think for them, it would be helpful just to hear about your ebb and flow, because I know you've had a setback, and I also know that this improves gradually over time. So could you perhaps just do maybe just quickly like a bird's eye view of what you've noticed with your improvement from when you were hurt up until now?
Yeah, like I mentioned, the tapering was manageable but rough at first. When I came off the drug, like I said, a month or two, I was figuring things out, but then it really kicked in. For the first, I would say 3 years, it was kind of rough for me. But even after the first year or so, I did sense things were slowly improving. And I would say until last year, 2023, things continually improved. My symptoms would change up. I would get some symptoms would come and go. Some would be new. Some would pass away, would pass on. But I could do a little more and more. Like I could work a little more and more. I could do stuff. And that's when I finally launched the podcast, because now I could do a podcast. I couldn't have done that early on. And I started working in research, because now I could actually do some data work for the research team, and I could come on there and help them. So I started taking on more because I know I was slowly functioning. Now I couldn't have gone back to an IT facility, and I still can't, that I know of, because of the stress and the pressure of that environment. But when I'm working at home and not pressured, I can function pretty well. And that continued to improve, and that's the good news, until a couple of years ago. But I do believe, and I strongly say this, there are other conditions that I think have led to that. For me, I believe COVID has been a significant factor. We talked about this on my podcast when you were on, Dr. Josef, and I've seen a lot of neurological complications from COVID. I've started researching that a lot, and we're actually going to hopefully launch a study here on bind and COVID, because there seems to be a lot of crossover, and I'm seeing it especially with muscle and nerve pain lately. It seems like it's been really significant. But I believe that was a factor. Both times I've had a setback in 2023 and this year in 2024 was within about a month of of COVID. And long COVID had kicked in. So I had the fatigue, I had the cough, I had everything else. And as that started to fade, I would get a wave of symptoms. And what was unique about these is these were symptoms I had never had before, which was rare for me at this far out, to get a wave of symptoms that were new. The first one was dysphagia, difficulty swallowing and throat tightening. I had the throat tightening, but I never really had the difficulty swallowing. Went through test after test, and that was 2023. And then this year was severe nerve pain. And that one came out of the blue, including a stabbing pain in my foot that would happen at random. So just at random, somebody would take a knife and stab me in the foot, and it'd last a few seconds and go away. What was interesting was when I started talking about this on the podcast was a number of people that have reached out and said I had very simple, especially foot pain, especially foot muscle cramping, especially calf cramping, leg issues. And I believe my foot pain is also tied to my calf. So this is where my lack of medical experience really gets in my way, because I can only understand so much. But what I'm trying to say is that my setbacks the last couple of years, while I know can be distressing to some, I believe have other causes. I think the benzos have made me susceptible and sensitive to maybe the complications of COVID or another factor.
Yeah.
Would be my belief system, because it doesn't feel like I was on a progression of healing. I was on a slow, steady progression of healing. And yes, I totally agree. I am one of the very rare ones to still have symptoms, this far out. I know other ones that had, I've talked to them, but we are definitely the minority, and most people heal far sooner than I have.
I think what's going on with these benzo injuries is, which you alluded to, is you're more susceptible to get these problems. And so, I know a lot of people listening to this have heard about long COVID, which is this constellation of neurological symptoms that people have after COVID. And gosh, it just makes sense that if you've already had an insult to your nervous system, which you're healing from, something that made you really sensitive, now you develop long COVID, or maybe, just a mild version of long COVID, which maybe most people kind of have, and they tolerate it because their nervous system isn't all fragile. But if you have this fragile nervous system, you are going to be the one that's going to experience these symptoms, and it may just be there while the long COVID runs its course, and then the healing will progress.
Exactly. Yeah, and the good news is I can tell you right now that the dysphagia did go away. I have maybe 5% of what I had a year ago. It's so much better. So I swallow much better, and the nerve pain has started to subside. I'm back functioning. I'm doing much better than I was. It comes on now and then, but I have ways of working around it now. So I do think that they are cycling through a more of a long COVID kind of pattern. And as that I start to heal from that, then I'm getting better. So that's the good news. But I do think exactly what you said was my thinking and kind of my pattern that I went through with this, trying to kind of put the pieces together. And now that I do research, it's like I'm always now thinking that way of, okay, how does this make sense from a physiological standpoint for what's going on, and there's too many coincidences here. There's probably something else behind this. And, it's not just the benzos. And I try to make people understand that this is not just the benzos for me. This is something else going on to a person who has been, somewhat damaged by benzodiazepines. So like you said, I'm more susceptible to other factors,
And I think I talked to you about this maybe on your podcast, about this patient that I'm looking after at the moment who was completely off his benzos, had protracted withdrawal injury, and then got diagnosed with mold by a functional medicine doctor. He moved out of his old mold-ridden house, and they found the mold there, into like a new hotel. And then they put him on Wecol, which is a drug that binds cholesterol, and because of that, it can pull toxins out of the body. They put him on that, and like ozone and some vitamin C, and within 3 weeks, his symptoms were 80% better, and they've stayed better. And I used to roll my eyes when people would tell me, I have mold, but I've seen enough of these cases now where it's like, yeah, I mean, maybe there are some people, breathing in mold toxins and they're tolerating it and it's fine and they have an intact nervous system. But once something like a benzo injury happens to you, even though you lived in that house your whole life and you were okay, it's a different game. I mean, it's a different nervous system now. And I do think that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And no, you got me thinking, because when you mentioned that, it started to make me thinking, because I didn't know I was as susceptible to that. And I realized I was a few years back, because my wife has always been the one that's more sensitive to things, especially allergens. But we went to an antique toy museum in Branson, Missouri on a trip a few years back. And after about 20 minutes in there, I left just throwing up my guts out on the street corner. And I was like that for like half an hour. And the only thing we can place back is these were old toys that hadn't been, totally cleaned and probably had a mold in them. But it was funny, my wife didn't get it at all. So something in there set me off with something I've never experienced before. But it does, so since what you said, I now kind of put things together like, okay, I need to be more careful of that and maybe should, check things out in my environment out, because that could be a factor. There's so many factors. We all know that I have to be a little more vigilant about my environmental factors than other people, because I don't want to say damaged. I'm just more sensitive. I'm more sensitive to some of these things out there. And I realize that.
And this isn't news to you, because I know you work closely with this population that once people get benzo injured, a lot of people develop food intolerances. I mean, I've got people on FODMAP diets. I've got people who are on low histamine diets. Yeah. And it's things that you previously tolerated. You just the sort of the sensitive nervous system just doesn't handle it anymore.
Yeah. Before I came off Clonazepam, I had done an Atkins one time, a low carb diet, but I didn't have any big problems with stomach. I mean, I had stomach issues, but not what I have now. And then I came off the drug, and that's when once I came off of it, after several years, I was doing the chicken and white rice as I started eating more. And then I started to see my problem with saccharides. And so that's when I started getting into more of the FODMAP. And that did help me a lot. I started to see where some of my problems were coming from, especially with the sugars.
Dee, I want to save some time now to actually talk about your professional career with respect to the drug injured community, because some people may not know of you and the wealth of knowledge and experience that you have. So maybe you can just, I mean, this was, unfortunately, you had to become kind of an expert in this, but maybe you could just walk us through when you started helping people professionally in this space, both kind of, as a coach, because I think you've done that before, but also as a researcher. Maybe you could just kind of tell us that story.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you for that. So when I first found out I was going through this, I did the research I mentioned to you for a long time, and I had all this research put together. I needed to do something with myself, even though I did have my wife who could provide financially. I've always been a worker, and I have to be working. And thank God I did, because working and keeping myself busy was probably one of those things that saved me through all this, was having a purpose, having something to focus on other than my symptoms and all the stuff that's going on. So I started putting it together for a couple of years. I wrote a book. In 2018, I published my book, which is Benzo Free: The World of Anti-Anxiety Drugs and the Reality of Withdrawal. And that's been doing pretty well out there. It's steady. It gets, every year I get that tiny check, from people who buy it. But I've had a lot of people who have said it's helpful. That got me thinking, if I wanted to promote the book, maybe I should do a podcast. I hadn't done a podcast before, but I used to play in bands. And so I had a lot of PA equipment and audio equipment. I figured, okay, I have the makings at home. I'm just going to take this soundboard I have here and some other stuff and put things together and do a podcast. So I launched the podcast in 2019, Benzo Free Podcast. It's now has over 40 or 50 episodes or something like that, and been going for 5.5 years. And that's been going well. And then from that, I started getting more involved with other organizations like the Alliance for Benzodiazepine Best Practices and Benzodiazepine Information Coalition, and started working with them. We started grassroots work in Colorado with legislation. We helped them get the the legislation, House Bill 1276 passed in Colorado, which was really good for prescribing benzodiazepines to put restrictions out there, and started working with a consortium out there. And we formed the Benzodiazepine Action Work Group, which was a collaboration of all these different benzo organizations. I co-chaired that with Dr. Alexis Ritvo for 3 years. And we created peer training. We did CME training. We did a lot of outreach, documentation. We've done a lot of work, and it was really great. And I've met a lot of people through that. I also got involved in research pretty early on with the benzodiazepine survey of 2018, 2019. And I was pulled in early on to do some of the data work since I had data background, and I understood the benzodiazepine population through my podcast. And so thankfully I got involved in that, and I've been an author on those 3 papers. I've been pulled into multiple research teams since then, and I worked with several ones. That survey team actually created the 3rd paper, was the BIND paper that introduced benzodiazepine induced neurological dysfunction. So I'm an author on that paper and part of the nosology team, which has been great. I've also been part of some of the ASAM work, the current ASAM deprescribing guidelines. I'm on that patient panel. And I've worked with some other group out of Ireland, some of their work with safeguarding benzos. And so I've been on, just keep getting pulled into research teams, which is kind of fun. And then kept working on stuff. I have a site called Easing Anxiety, which is my support site. And then just bring me up to today, October 1st, we did a soft launch of Uneven. And Uneven is my new membership site that I mentioned. And it is uneven.life is the URL. It's totally free through the end of the year. And that's actually an online community. It's community-led. It's peer-led. And we're just creating a group. We have over 150 members now, and I think 165 now, and we're growing strong. And I think it's going to be really good. And we're teaming up with people like Taper Clinic and other stuff and trying to help promote each other and send people back and forth and kind of keep things going. But that's been great. So now we have an online community. We have over 3,000 interactions a week on that site already in just the first 2 months. So it's become really active and helping a lot of people. We do a lot of live streams. We got all kinds of activity on there. So I think that's where I'm at. Hopefully that summed it up.
And so, yeah. Specifically with respect to the membership site, because that does sound like that's the platform where you are interacting with people who are having these problems. Who do you see as a good fit for this site? So when you kind of think about like the person that you were trying to help there, or persons, maybe you could kind of speak to that a little bit so people know, yep, that's me.
That's a really good point. Of course, my background was benzodiazepines and then anxiety. I've been working with anxiety for a few years now from support, but we opened this site up to also work with antidepressants, GABAergic drugs, and other things, just because there's been so much crossover. So let me back up. One of the things that I think we liked is I created this skeleton in October and launched it. And then as everybody came in, I created this founding members club, which is all the people signed on and that joined us in the first few months. And I've been running everything by them. They've been telling me what they want. So it's really been a community-led organization, and that's what I love about it. So they told me they wanted an antidepressant space. We created one. They told me they wanted a book club, and we just started our book club. They told me they wanted a taper section or space. And so we have all these subgroups within the community for all these different areas. And so the people we really help is anybody who is struggling with, and our motto is basically life, anxiety, medication. So one of those 3 or all of those 3 things, that's the audience that we're trying to reach out to. It's the audience we have experience with. And it's been great. I've learned so much just from that audience since I've been on there. I mean, I've been working with people through the podcast for 6 years, and I've learned so much in the last just 2 months because I'm on there nonstop, and it's been very educational. So it's been great. And we're going to be adding on some support groups starting next year, and probably hopefully working closer with some of the tapering clinics and like yourselves and other ones, and figuring out how to do all that. But we are mostly a community and a community-led organization. That's probably how we differ a little bit.
So it sounds like you can go on there and you can get resources for, life, anxiety, tapering. It sounds like you can connect with people who are interested in that and going through it. And that also in the near future, you may have some group coaching as well, where people could come and
we might. We'll probably do some support. We will be doing support groups, and we will be doing courses. On the coaching piece, I'll admit up front right now is we're still figuring out what that looks like. because there are so many good coaches and coach organizations and tapering organizations, it may be where we more team up with those organizations on the tapering level and work with them and provide more of a community to support that. And I kind of like that direction rather than taking on coaching ourselves. But we do want to do some support groups, and we do want to do the courses. We'll start teaching courses. But I'm not sure if doing coaching is going to recreate the wheel, because I think there's some really good resources out there right now. If it's already out there, I'd rather work with people like yourself and other people who have already built networks and do that. So I can't speak right now what we're going to do yet, because we're kind of letting the community lead it, as I mentioned up front. But that's where we're at right now. So we will be adding the higher level, which is the support group. And we also have another concept that we're kind of a handhold, where somebody comes in who's new to this whole area and freaking out and all that kind of stuff, to have that one guide, that person who we can assign them and say, this person's with you. They're going to walk you through this. And that's one of the pieces that, we hadn't seen that much before. Kind of, I know you guys do some of that too, where it's just having that one person to say, hey, I got your back. We got you here. Don't worry about it. We're going to get you through this. And so that's what I want to do with this second tier we'll be launching next year, is kind of get that going. Not really coaching, but more of somebody who can guide them around the world, the benzos around the world of ADs, and help them get associated with it and acclimated to what's going on.
Okay. Well, Dee, we've covered a lot. People,
yeah.
I'm glad people know what you're doing and where to find you. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about, which you'd like to share with this audience before we wrap for the day?
I think it's just closing out with the hope and with I've done this a long time. I've been in this industry, I guess industry is the right word, for 11, 12 years now. Seen a lot of things come and go, and I've seen a lot of it happen and work with a lot of people. But I think the number one thing, and I just want to make sure I always leave people with this, is that we do heal. If there's one thing I have seen repeatedly, even in the most difficult cases, is we heal. It really helps to have help. It really helps to have people help guide you. It helps people to have help to help you taper off. And, we work a lot with the protracted side of things on our side and uneven and what it's like living with the after effects somewhat. But whether it's tapering with like Taper Clinic with Dr. Josef, or it's more of a, working with the life after and some of the work we do, there's a lot of help. There's a lot of people. There's so much more out there right now than when I started. And I'm amazed at all the support out there right now. So just find one of us out here and go out there and ask for some help, because you don't have to do this alone. We do heal. We do get through this, and life does get a lot better. I still have some symptoms 10 years out, but I am so much happier than I was. I'm living a full life. I'm living a good life, and life got a lot better for me. So I think that's the main thing.
Great. Well, Dee, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, and this has been a pleasure.
For more real-life stories on the devastating impact of benzodiazepines, watch Kelsey Krause share her powerful and heartbreaking journey here